Thank you for starting the recording. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marissa Williams. I am a manager with Third Sector, and we are providing technical assistance to Lake County as part of the multi-county innovation project for FSP. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to be sure to introduce myself and my colleagues up front so that you all know who is on the line. I will let Nicole and Jason also introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name's Nicole Christie. I'm a director here at Third Sector, also supporting the multi-county FSP innovation project. And I've actually been working on the project since 2020 with the original 6 counties. And now there are 9 counties in this project. And then I'll turn it over to Jason.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Pace. I'm a senior associate with Third Sector. I've been working with them for about 2.5 years now. I've supported Lake County in the first phase of the multi-county project, and I've also worked with a couple other counties on their landscaping phase and their graduation guideline improvement process. So excited to be here.
All right, thanks, Jason and Nicole. So I'll give you a little overview of what we'll talk about today, and then we'll do a little connect exercise to get to know everyone. So we'll talk a little bit, as I said, about the multi-county collaborative. Then we will share the updated or clarified eligibility criteria and guidelines, and we'll break out into some small groups to practice using those. And then we'll have some time for question and answers. So first I wanted to just start, since I am new to many of you, though I know many faces in this room, I wanted to get a gauge of how comfortable and familiar are folks with FSP. So if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat your number on this scale of how familiar you are, and walking in, if you're like, what is FSP? That would put you down at a 1. If you are an experienced person in FSP, you'd put yourself down at a 10. So just curious to see in the room how folks are feeling.
No, I got it.
See some 7s. Gina is a 10. 6, we have a 2 and 4, 5.
Yes. Hmm? Yeah.
All right, anyone else? So it sounds like, looks like we have a good range. I'm excited that no one is at a 1, but we will talk a little bit about what FSP is as well. So for those of you who are falling a little bit earlier on that scale, that will help you get oriented to this conversation as well. So full service partnerships are services that deliver a diverse range of evidence-based service to individuals dealing with severe mental illness. And so that can include therapy, psychiatric services, peer support services, housing services, and a wide range of case management services. And as many of you probably already know. So we wanted to just be sure that we kind of center this in the fact that we want to be thoughtful about who is FSP serving, and that's why these eligibility criteria are so important. FSPs don't share a consistent process for defining the populations that they serve or tracking enrollment and outcomes, and we have been working with, as Nicole mentioned, originally 6 counties, and now we are about to add 1 final county for a total of 9 counties that we have worked with to talk about kind of how could we think through some of these processes and define more clearly who FSP serves and how they are being served in order to provide a clearer and more supportive environment for FSP consumers. FSP is the populations are stipulated by the Mental Health Services Act regulations and designed to provide consumer-centric services to achieve their goals. We, as I mentioned, have been working with folks at Lake County. So many of you have joined in a work group or a focus group. We wanted to be clear about who this team is that's working with all of you. So from third sector, as we said, that's Marissa, Nicole, and Jason. And then on our main work group team, we've had Scott, Gina, Hattie, Crystal, Zabdi, Elizabeth, and Elise attending some or all of our work group meetings. And that started with a landscape assessment where we spent some time just getting to know your FSP programs and learning about how you all are collecting data, how you're delivering services, so that we could better provide some support to improving those programs. So the Multi-County Innovation Project has 5 main goals. So these center around that idea, again, of clarifying who FSP serves, what are their goals, and how are we measuring success. So that's developing a shared understanding and interpretation of the core components of the program, increasing clarity and consistency of the enrollment criteria, referral, and graduation processes, improving how counties define, track, and apply priority outcomes, developing a clear strategy for tracking outcomes and performance measures, and developing new or strengthening existing processes for continuous improvement. So of those 5 big goals, that's a lot. Right now, we're really focused in on goal number 2 for Lake County. During our landscape assessment, we uncovered some feelings of confusion and a lack of understanding of those enrollment criteria, and wanting to provide all of you with a lot more guidance around what it looks like to be eligible for FSP. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. Are there any questions about the Multi-County Collaborative before we move forward? And feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute. All right.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry, Marissa. This is April Gambra, Clinical Deputy Director for Behavioral Health. I'm curious, do we ever work in conjunction with the other counties, or are we just as part of this program operating kind of in a silo independent needs assessment?
So yeah, that's a great question. So Lake and Stanislaus counties were what we are calling our wave 2 of our counties. And so a lot of the work for the wave 1 counties, those first 6 that we mentioned, happened a little bit before you all joined. But there was some overlap at the end of the larger cohort where some folks from your work group, Scott, Elise, Gina, and others joined in some of those meetings. And the goals there, if I'll go back to the schools page. So around this improving how counties define, track, and apply priority outcomes, the biggest work across county was to have define some very clear cross-county outcomes that you all will look at. And as part of this project, there will be a full-scale evaluation, and those outcomes will be looked at through the evaluation, which will take place actually after our initial technical assistance that third sector will be working with you all. The partner there is RAND, who is providing that evaluation. And so that will be a great opportunity for you all to learn cross-county because each county will have an evaluation. And then we also defined some different population or created some population definitions to help folks talk cross-county, so that when you're kind of talking about your homeless population, you know that you're actually talking about the same population as another county. And so all of that work is sort of intertwined here, but we definitely right now are focusing, as you said, on that kind of individual work with the county.
Thank you for explaining. I appreciate that.
I think I would just add one thing, Marissa, if that's okay. She mentioned that you all are kind of our wave 2 or our second cohort with Stanislaus County, and we actually have Napa County joining hopefully next month. And so the 3 counties that are currently getting technical assistance from third sector will be working together and doing group meetings and collaboration and learning communities and things like that.
Thanks, Nicole. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Crystal to talk a little bit about kind of where we are now and our eligibility criteria and guidelines that were clarified.
So we've worked together to clarify our eligibility criteria, develop the guidelines, and how we do that so that it is more clear for all of our clinicians and clinical staff when referring or recommending someone for FSP. And then the process, and just explain how that process looks like as well. Sorry, I just lost my spot. So we'll share those with you, and then we always, like feedback as well.
Yeah, so we also baked into this slide some time for you all to use the criteria before we kind of finalize them.
Yes.
So this will be kind of a training for you all to see the clarifications and the guidelines, and then we'll come back to you all for some feedback on how that's working.
Mm-hmm. So during this first phase, it was really identifying like where the challenges were about eligibility, and how we can clarify those to make it easier for everybody that is doing assessments or seeing clients, and what the guidelines are, not only for our FSP adults, but also for our TAY and children's services, which Elizabeth will help when it comes to that population. We acknowledge that the manual that we have had and utilized wasn't always exactly very clear, and sometimes we become confused. So our goal is to have clear and concise and easy for all of us. So right now, our access team does the first assessment, and then clinicians do the second. So when the clinician thinks or feels someone could be appropriate for the FSP program, they will send that to the team lead on how are they appropriate, how do they meet the criteria. The team lead will review it, and then it feels it is a good, it does meet all that criteria, then goes to the clinical program manager, Zabdi, or it'll go to Elise in Zabdi's absence for that final approval or denial. And then I will bring it back to the referring party for adults. And then for children and TAY, that would be Elizabeth. And then we're also developing like conversation pieces on good ways to have these answer questions and in conversation with our consumers. So our adult FSP criteria, serious mental health illness is identified, and then one or more of the following: having been admitted to a psychiatric hospital in the past 2 years. We typically look for multiple hospitalizations. And it is obviously psychiatric, it's due to their mental health illness. And then as a result of their mental health illness and symptoms, they're homeless or in an out-of-home placement, at risk of being homeless, or losing housing, involved in the criminal justice system within the past year, and their charges having been related directly to their mental health illness as well. Our conserved population, coming home from placement, or being discharged from an acute psychiatric facility. And we don't see very many from a state hospital, but we do get those. And then our older adults can be considered for FSP as well. If they're experiencing like the increase in isolation, inability for social community functioning, difficulty with housing as well.
Are there any questions on the adult criteria?
I'll turn this one over to Elizabeth.
So now I'm going to go over the criteria for children's and transitional aged youth criteria for FSP services. So this stuff is really important for those of you who are going to bring this to me to remember, because I'm going to ask you to type up an email and touch on all these points just to make sure that like all the criteria is met. So first we'll start with children. And so we're looking at children who are seriously emotionally disturbed and or meet one of the following. So as a result of their mental illness, the child has substantial impairment in at least 2 areas. So we're looking for 2 areas of like severe functional impairment. And so we're looking at school, self-care, ability to function in the community, family relationships, justice involvement, and if they're at risk of removal from the home. And then the next one is and/or number 2, we're looking for due to their mental health illness or their mental health challenges, they're at serious risk of having a history of psychiatric hospitalization, crisis services, residential care, psychotic features, suicide, violence, or out-of-home placement. And 3 are at risk or are ready to be released from juvenile hall or residential placement. So these are kids who are getting out of juvie or a strip. So now transitional age youth need to meet the children's criteria, plus there are some additional criteria for them. So for our youth ages 16 to 25, in addition to the, criteria for children, they need to be unserved or underserved in one of the following areas. So they need to be homeless or at risk of being homeless, aging out of the child welfare system, aging out of the juvenile justice system, involved in the criminal justice system, at risk of involuntary hospitalization or institutionalization, or have experienced a first episode of serious mental illness. So I know I'm going to ask, and I'm sorry, I'm bad with names, but we also came up with a form that's really detailed, and we're going over that next, right?
Yep.
Cool, because that's going to be what's really going to help the staff like identify, okay, does this person really meet criteria for FSP? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yes, so the second thing that in addition to clarifying those criteria and making sure they're really clear kind of in that initial summary, the work group spent some time developing guidelines which create a really clear outline of for each of those criteria. What does that actually mean? And what are some examples of someone who might meet that criteria? So I'll turn it back to Crystal. And we don't need to go through, I think, each and every one of these, but maybe highlighting some of the top ones. And then folks, you'll have this link, and I'll drop this link in the chat as well, to print out and use if that's the easiest way for you to use it.
Yes. And I would highly encourage all of our staff that do send FSP requests to have this printed out, so that, when you do email us, like Elizabeth said, you can hit all those marks that are needed. So our homelessness, they're living on the streets, or living in place that is not meant for human habitation, which outside abandoned vehicles, buses, emergency shelters. I know we don't have those now. But when we get one back, Sometimes they're exiting conservatorship. Hopefully we will already have them stable, because if they're conserved, they're probably FSP. Our justice involved, it needs to be within the last 12 months, probation diversion or probation diversion on a pattern of that involvement with law enforcement. So it's not, just like, oh, one time they got in trouble. There's a history. And then we look at their psychiatric hospitalizations. Have they been in a psychiatric or state hospital within the past 2 years? How often are the crisis interventions being provided? Maybe they haven't been to a psychiatric hospitalization, but in the last 6 months, they've been seen by crisis 3 times. History of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and if they've been previously conserved as well, as important factors to always know as well. And then additional factors too that can also make someone potentially eligible is, their dual diagnosis, being released from conservatorship and discharged from hospitals.
Gina, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, and I don't know if I'm over speaking, but I believe like homelessness due to their mental illness, not
all of these have to be due to mental illness. It's individuals with severe mental illness can be considered a FSP, meeting one or more of the below criteria.
right. And then using community resources as well. Like if we see someone that is experiencing domestic violence, it's always like we use all other resources first before we tap into FSP funds.
Yes.
Or in collaboration.
Yes, we collaborate with many other partners and agencies, and FSP, is the, I guess, the payer of last resort is what they call it. You can correct me if I just said that wrong, Scott.
No, that's right.
Okay. So we do want to look at all natural support systems, all community resources first and foremost. Any questions on these guidelines? And this is I like this better than the other slide. It's very kind of bullet pointed out, very specific, and easy for each of you to read and have to look back and make sure all the points are being hit.
Any questions from the group?
I don't see the forms in the chat. Did you guys drop them in there?
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. So I would just thank you for following up about that, Gina. I would recommend you guys pull that up now, because we're going to be doing some vignettes at the end of this as an activity that you're going to want these forms for. Okay, everyone, just so people know.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. And I will pull up the child form now.
So as you guys can see, we've also broken down both the child and the TAY criteria. Can you zoom in on that? On my little laptop, that writing is so small.
I was trying to locate my Zoom button.
Thank you. So the first one is the substantial impairment in school, community, or family functioning. And we really broke down the school, the self-care, community functioning, and the family relationships piece. So, do they have an IEP due to emotional disturbance? Are they participating in an educational program due to emotional disturbance? So as you can see, everything kind of links back to this mental health challenge that they're having. Again, we go down to self-care, and then lack of a demonstrated ability to get out of the house to meet basic needs. if they can't shower or brush their teeth in the morning. Or this is the community involvement piece, and this is where we look at their social and peer relationships. And this includes like reoccurrent violent interactions or the inability to maintain and keep friendships. Family relationships. So there's a lot of conflict in the home, which is directly linked to the youth's mental health challenges. Doesn't talk to family members due to mental health challenges, isolation in the home, compassion fatigue. So the parents are getting really burnt out because of dealing with this, or there's violence in the home due to the emotional disturbance. So next we break down the risk or history of psychiatric hospitalizations and services due to mental health illness. And this again, like the adult team, it really breaks down like the numbers. So 1+ psychiatric hospitalization in the last 12 months. Have they received a crisis assessment in the last 6 months? So we have like clear guidelines on what we're looking for as far as, you know, numbers and criteria. We can keep scrolling down. And then the last piece, so we're looking to clarify, I think we hadn't got there, but are they going to be released from juvenile hall, or are they being released from residential placement? And our probation department and our CWS department is really good at communicating with us prior to the release so we can arrange services. That's been my experience. So.
Nice. All right, so with that, as Elizabeth mentioned, we are going to do some small group scenarios. And so what we're going to do is break you all out into breakout rooms, and each group will have about 7 minutes to read through the scenarios. They're very short, I promise, and determine if they think that that individual is or is not eligible for FSP. And then if an individual is not eligible, we'd like you to create a brief script to explain why that person is not eligible for FSP. And it could be either to the person, or it could be back to a referring partner, or back to the team lead to say, here's my summary of why I don't think this person is eligible. So with that, I'm going to start our breakout rooms. Some technical difficulties.
Have access to the vignettes in their breakout rooms, Marissa?
If you'll need to open this slide deck. So if you don't already have the slide deck open, I will drop it in the chat one more time. And that way, hopefully at least one person in each breakout room will have it. All right. All right, thanks everyone for your patience. We are going to go ahead and move forward as one large group. And I will go ahead and share my screen again so that you all can see the scenarios. So scenario 1, Samantha is a 39-year-old woman living in Clear Lake. She has been diagnosed with bipolar 1. Her most recent bipolar episode was depression. She's currently employed full-time as a barista. She's been living with a roommate who will be moving out of their shared apartment. She cannot afford the rent on her own, and she's been unable to find another roommate. She will need to move out at the end of the month. She has no criminal legal history, and her most recent hospital visit was in 2018. So I'll open it up if folks not from our work group want to share their...
Hopefully someone from the adult team on this one.
I'm not gonna say anything.
I'd be willing to share. I'm on the EIS team.
Go ahead, Susanna.
Okay. Based on the criteria presented, it sounds as though she's not going to meet criteria for FSP. It doesn't sound like her losing her apartment is due to mental illness. It sounds more of like a situational event. And because she's working full time and she hasn't been hospitalized since 2018, I'm thinking that would be a no.
Do other folks agree?
I agree.
Hearing a lot of agreement. Is anyone uncertain? Would anyone like to ask a team lead for help or clarification?
Phone a friend.
It sounds as though she'd be able to possibly find another apartment, maybe a 1-bedroom. It just doesn't sound like it meets the need for FSP.
I think we have agreement. I'm curious if anybody would like to take a stab at how you would explain either to a partner or to this individual why she's not eligible.
The fact she can hold down a job full time, it shows that she has pretty good functioning. And that alone kind of gives me the indication that she may not really need FSP.
So that she didn't lose her apartment due to her mental illness, and that's like the first thing that has to be in place. Sounds like she's managing her bipolar 1, which is a diagnosis that can get you qualified for FSP if you meet the other scenarios. But yeah, no criminal history either, the hospitalization. So yeah, she's somewhat stable in the community.
Thanks, Jana. Crystal or Gina, is there anything you would add? I think folks covered it pretty well, but just want to be sure.
Nope, that is the correct answer.
All right, we'll move on to scenario 2. Would somebody else like to read this?
I can read it.
Thanks, Scott.
Jerome is a 17-year-old youth living in a 3-bedroom home in Nice with his father. Jerome has been doing well in some classes, but failing others. He's having difficulty with socializing and friendships. Has been suspended for fighting with his peers. His father reports that Jerome does not have any friends currently. Jerome and his father do not have a good relationship due to his behaviors and symptoms. Jerome has been diagnosed with depression and was recently hospitalized after a suicide attempt. During his hospitalization, it was noted that Jerome was experiencing hallucinations.
I would say that he is qualified for FSP services.
Can you elaborate, Rachel?
Just due to his symptoms and his hospitalization, recent hospitalization for a suicide attempt, and because of his hallucinations. I would say, yeah, qualifies.
I have a question. And I was coming to my mind earlier and I didn't ask it, but it has to do with the family's financial status. And that is not in this vignette, but I'm curious, say this family was just very exorbitantly wealthy. I don't know that then he would qualify, but if they were very poor in, maybe struggling to meet their basic needs, that and which is not noted in here, I think that would be maybe a determining factor.
From what I understand, FSP is, you can still receive the services of FSP, but not the financial component. So services mean individual rehab, therapy, and all that stuff, but you cannot have like the financial component. If he makes a wealth of money, I mean, there's no reason to use, these resources for such things. But I would imagine he would be able to get this wraparound services. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
And remember on the guidelines we just went over, There's nothing about, in the criteria being family finances.
Right, and that was a question I was having in my mind about, whether how much stability financially, whether that would determine a case being accepted or not. So it sounds as though that's not a factor. Interesting.
Any other questions that this scenario raises for folks?
I would just like to point out the emotional, like the relationship aspect of the scenario, how the relationships with his family and his peers are being strained on. And so I think that is a big component on someone who might meet criteria for FSP, is that, hey, they're not having any friends. Their relationship with their parent family is really, really strained. That's also like a really, really big factor that a lot of people overlook.
So I have a question to pose to the group. This person also looks like they'd meet the criteria for EIS, early intervention services. So what's the difference between that and FSP?
I had a conversation about that with Elise on Monday after I saw this vignette, and it sounds like that's going to be a larger conversation to have at another time. But for the time being, this would be an EIS client who's receiving FSP services through the EIS team, because they have that first episode component in my mind that still needs that specialized treatment model. So yeah. So I don't know. I think it's a larger conversation. That's a wonderful question.
I was thinking the same thing. I was wondering about that because of the oscillation and then hallucination. So
It really would come down to what are the, there's probably a little more assessment that needs to be done, to determine what the treatment plan would be, how intensive services are needed for this individual.
Yeah, at the difficult piece that came up for me was that really EIS is supposed to be extremely intensive services, very similar to FSP. The main difference is really the financial assistance that FSP clients receive. So yeah, so that's why it feels like definitely more assessment, but I think also agency-wide, like a larger conversation probably needs to be had about kind of how the new criteria is going to not just impact the EIS team, but the children's team, because without having that financial hardship component we've looked at in the past, that really also opens up criteria as well. So, yeah.
I saw a question in the chat of how long ago was the hospitalization, and that's a great question. I think in the scenario, it says recently. It's not stipulated exactly how recently, but I think we can take recently to mean within the time period, but that's an important factor of looking at whether or not he might be eligible. All right, we had reserved a little time for sharing out, but since we did this as a large group, we can move on to just a couple of highlights to make sure that everyone is aware on frequently asked questions, who is currently responsible for making eligibility determinations. So Zabdi would be in that role as soon as she returns from leave, but currently that's Elise. And if someone has a potential question about eligibility, your team lead might be the first stop, but if not, then Zabdi would be the correct person to ask. And we did begin developing a resource for folks if you are looking for an opportunity to think through how you might explain someone's lack of eligibility. And this covers a few different scenarios for folks that we felt like were common scenarios for folks to experience. So if someone does not have an SMI diagnosis, that's kind of the key factor there. And just explaining that their symptoms are considered mild or moderate. If the consumer does have an SMI diagnosis, but doesn't meet the additional criteria, kind of explaining that. And I think Samantha was doing that really well with the explanation of someone who has a job and is showing really strong functioning, that's an opportunity to just explain, you know, this person is actually doing well. And that means that they're not going to be eligible for FSP services, and just be clear about those specific factors. And we talked a little bit about this in the first scenario, but the concern or issue around the various ways in which someone might be homeless, justice involved, have financial hardships, but that those things are not related to their behavioral health diagnosis. So that those would be things that you would need to explain. You know, I understand that the person is homeless or is about to be homeless, but that if it's not related to their behavioral health symptoms, that's not going to be a factor that would allow them to be eligible for FSP. Similarly, if someone might have justice involvement, but I think Crystal kind of mentioned, you know, if that was a one-off instance that doesn't appear to be related to their symptoms, that's not going to trigger eligibility for FSP. And then if a consumer has financial hardship, but that might be, you know, we're all in an economy where lots of people are having financial hardship, it may not be connected to their behavioral health diagnosis, or you may not see any kind of indicators of there being kind of impulsive spending or impulsive issues that are creating those financial hardships. So this is just a resource that's linked in this doc for you all. If you want to use it, if you're kind of thinking through like, oh, you know, this person, I think they're eligible, but then, you know, it's not related to their behavioral health diagnosis. This is where you can kind of look for a little bit of support in framing those things. Any questions on any of these? These are also, I guess, kind of scenarios.
No, you can't be FSP to pay off credit card debt. Sorry, folks. I've actually had those referrals. I've had them as an FSP client. I'm like, what?
Yes, all of these examples were taken from Crystal and Zabdi and Elizabeth's experiences with FSP. All right, I will pop back here and we'll pause if anybody has any additional questions, if it would be helpful to go back and revisit any of the guidelines. Just want to give you all some space for that. Stop sharing so that we can all see each other. Are there any questions about FSP eligibility that we did not answer that you all have?
We're going to have more trainings in the future about, you know, being an FSP and particularly graduating as an FSP, which I know is a big challenge. But this training is just, you know, mostly focusing on eligibility and you know, making the right referrals.
One thing that just popped up in my mind is how FSP is like a last resort payer. And it's like, so when we finish the assessment and we give them all the referrals, like go to Lake Family Resource Center or Hope Center or whatever, we don't follow up with them after that point. Like, we don't know if those referrals were successful or not. I guess, does that just fall on the client to contact Lake County Behavioral Health, or we should kind of put in a little line there, if these referrals are dead ends, please contact us in the future?
You probably would want to follow up at the moment, but we are actually developing a whole new system that will probably address that. It's called the Community Hub. And it's going to be electronic referrals, closed loop referral system, but also you'll be able to follow the client after referrals are made. So
Wow,
you'll be also connected to our coordinated entry housing system too. So it'll be pretty cool when we get it going. It's almost ready to go.
okay, that's great to know. Thank you. I guess one other thing that I thought of, so it's like we have all this money from the Mental Health Service Act, but then it comes down to providers who can follow the people through the FSP program. That becomes a limitation, right? That's part of our limitation of who we can offer, how many we can take on. Earlier when the Mental Health Service Act was being talked about, I was like, I wonder if some of that money could be used to like hire people so we can expand FSP. Maybe that's a perfect world scenario, but you know, I know that that's also a barrier to people getting services who need it. That's I guess a staffing issue that comes up, and I don't know if there's a solution to that or not.
Well, probably the biggest challenge with that is we have the allocated positions. It's just filling the positions, which is, and you know, keeping people is the biggest challenge that we seem to be having.
And it's happening everywhere. It's not just here. It's literally everywhere.
Yeah,
And it's everyone's having the same.
Provider shortage.
I don't know if this is, I wanted to say, because our doctors, the meds providers, they work, you know, with NAMS, they have the contract with NAMS. And before James left, he was talking about a possibility of looking into a contract with them for their therapists. So I don't know if anybody's still doing that. Maybe that would be a good idea. They have a contract to offer.
Yeah, we'll have to. I'm not sure where that went either. Let's see, April's not here right now. I'll talk to her about it.
Yeah, she got booted out for some reason and can't get back in. And on my end, it's saying she's offline. So.
Okay.
Let's have MediaCom.
Gotta pay the internet bill.
We are in the very preliminary stages of this, but we are also doing some research around workforce issues in the behavioral health system as part of our work with Stanislaus County. So there may be some lessons learned from that we're able to share because, as I think Gina just said, everyone is dealing with this across the board. It's a really, really difficult time.
It's called the Great Recession. I'm serious. That's what they named it.
Didn't we already have one of those?
We're having it just keep going, you know, long Great Recession.
Do you mean the Great Resignation? Because that's what I've heard it called. It's the Great Resignation. Everybody's putting all their jobs.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what it is. The Great Resignation.
Mm-hmm.
There was one more thing. I know we have like 3 minutes or whatever, but just because I do the second assessment with people and try to connect them to services, and then I will look at their file and notice that there's been like a 2-month gap and it doesn't seem like anything's moving, and these people needed housing yesterday. Like what it seems like the process for them getting qualified and being eligible has some delays in it, or there's like some big gaps in services, and I just wonder about that piece, if it's been addressed, or is that just part of the nature of the beast, that these things take a long time to get through administration. It's hard because we don't have those emergency housing shelters, and there's a wait list for months for every other housing option. So it's just maybe it's like a personal thing. It's hard to watch I'm thinking these people aren't getting served and there's nothing I can do about it. I just wonder about that part of the process. If it does take a huge chunk of time, like, is there any way to speed it up or prioritize people, or, that's just sometimes frustrating with the approval process, I guess.
That's a good question. We are having significant capacity issues, and at all levels throughout the agency. So from the bottom all the way to the top, which means everybody's taking on way more than they should, and things are not moving as quickly as they should, and balls are getting dropped. So, and that, so that links back into what you had said previously of we need more people, and it's at everywhere in behavioral health right now. It's really, agencies are really struggling, and it's hard to see because the clients are the ones who are ultimately suffering. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So yeah.
The nature of the beast then.
Yeah, but that doesn't feel, I don't know, I'm not going to get too philosophical. It still doesn't feel right. So yeah.
Okay.
And some of it's the ability to reach people like, hey, I need to figure out some more information, but they never answer the phone. Or they don't call back, or, so that.
True, lack of engagement is a huge thing.
Deads it in the water too a bit.
Well, we do have a little bit of flexibility. Not sure if this would help. If you have someone who appears to meet criteria for FSP, but they haven't been officially, gone through all the hoops to be approved, we could start using FSP funds to help them. There is, it's the idea that this person's going to be an FSP. It's pretty obvious they're going to meet that criteria. There's not a big question. Which is important why we have that training today, so you can kind of recognize that. We can go ahead and try and help someone, like get them a motel or something like that to help out. Last thing we want to do is have someone suffering just because of our slowness,
Mm-hmm.
I see that we are at 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for coming today. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact any of the folks on the work group, and they'll get those into our work group conversations. As I mentioned, we're hoping that you all will kind of print those out, keep using them. If you have questions about eligibility that come up over the next couple of months, think about whether those criteria and guidelines help answer those questions or not. And we'll be circling back with a survey in a couple of months to see kind of how that's going and if there's anything that needed to be clarified or changed as part of the criteria.
Are you on the East Coast?
I am on the East Coast. Did I say a time-based thing that I
1
didn't
o'clock,
notice?
about 3 hours ahead of us.
I am in Cleveland, Ohio right now, and it is 1 o'clock, but I recognize that it is probably 10 o'clock for everyone else. Thanks, Scott. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great morning.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.